My daughter's fiancé smirked when he announced developers were coming tomorrow. I just sent one text to my apprentices. 32 cars showed up. His face went white. Before I tell you how I humbled a man who thought money was everything, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe respect is earned, not bought. It didn't start with a scream. It started with a thud. The heavy, dull sound of a thick legal binder hitting the dining table, landing right on top of the roasted turkey breast I had spent 6 hours basting with rosemary and butter. Gravy splattered onto the pristine white tablecloth my wife had embroidered 20 years ago. The room went silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. I looked from the ruined dinner to the man standing at the head of my table. Trey Caldwell, my daughter's fiancé. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first 3 cars combined, and he had that look on his face, the look of a man who had just closed a deal and was waiting for the applause. He didn't apologize for the gravy on the cloth. He didn't apologize for interrupting the prayer. He just tapped the binder with a manicured fingernail and smiled. "Happy Thanksgiving, Cliff. Consider this your retirement gift." I stared at the cover of the binder. In bold red letters it read, "Demolition order and site clearance 42 Oak Street. My address, my home, my workshop." I put my fork down, my hand shaking slightly. Not from fear, but from a rage that started in my gut and worked its way up to my throat like hot oil. I looked at my daughter Sarah. She was sitting to my right, staring intensely at her mashed potatoes, refusing to meet my eyes. Her knuckles were white as she gripped her napkin. "What is this, Trey?" I asked, my voice lower than the rumble of an idling V8 engine. "It is the future, Cliff." Trey pulled out a chair and sat down, not to eat, but to lecture. He opened the binder, flipping past pages of legalese to a colorful architectural rendering. "Look at that. It is beautiful, isn't it? The Caldwell Plaza. 6 luxury condo units with a heated underground garage. And right where your greasy falling down workshop stands. That is going to be the jewel of the neighborhood. A regulation-size pickleball court for the residents." I felt a sharp pain in my chest right along the scar where the surgeons had cracked my ribs open 6 months ago. I took a shallow breath. Pickleball. You want to tear down a workshop that has restored some of the most important muscle cars in Michigan history to build a court for a game played with plastic paddles? Trey laughed. It was a dry, hollow sound. "Oh, come on, Cliff. Do not get sentimental. That shed is a cancer on this property value. It smells like old gas and failure. The neighbors hate it. The homeowners association hates it. I am doing you a favor. I am liquidating a distressed asset so you can finally afford to go into that assisted living facility in Florida. You know, the one with the nurses who can make sure you take your pills." I stood up. My knees popped. I am 72 and my joints are worn out from 50 years of bending over engine bays and lifting transmission cases, but I am not an invalid. "Get out," I said. I pointed a finger stained permanently with grease at the door. "Get out of my house. And take your paperwork with you. This deed is in my name. I bought this land in 1982. I built that shop with my own hands before you were even born. You cannot touch a single brick of it." That was when the air left the room. Trey didn't leave. He didn't even flinch. He just leaned back in his chair, picked up a dinner roll, and took a bite, chewing slowly, while he looked at me with pity. That arrogant, weaponized pity that young men in finance have for men who work with their hands. "Tell him Sarah," Trey said, his mouth full of bread. I turned to my daughter, my little girl, the one I had taught to change the oil on a Chevy Nova when she was 9 years old, the one whose college tuition I had paid for by working double shifts and restoring wrecks on weekends. "Sarah," I asked, "what is he talking about?" She finally looked up. Her eyes were red-rimmed with tears, but her jaw was set. It was a look of stubbornness I recognized because she got it from me. But the words that came out of her mouth were not hers. They sounded rehearsed, scripted by the man eating my dinner rolls. "Dad, please," she whispered. "We are doing this for you. You almost died on the table during your surgery. The doctor said you cannot be lifting heavy tools anymore. You cannot be breathing in those fumes. I am recovering, Sarah. I am back in the shop 3 days a week. It is my life. It keeps me going. It is too much liability." "Dad," she snapped, her voice rising. "Trey explained it to me. If you get hurt out there alone, who finds you? And the property taxes are going up. We cannot afford to keep the land just so you can tinker with rust buckets." "We?" I asked. "Since when is it we?" "It is my land." Trey cleared his throat. "Actually, Cliff, that is the funny part. Remember when you were in the ICU, when you were hooked up to all those machines and you didn't know if it was Tuesday or Christmas? You signed some papers to make sure Sarah could handle your medical bills, to make sure she could make decisions if you didn't wake up." I froze. I remembered the fog of anesthesia, the pain. Sarah holding my hand, crying, putting a pen in my fingers, telling me it was just for the insurance company. Just standard procedure, Dad. Just so they don't stop the surgery. Power of attorney, Trey said, savoring the syllables like fine wine. Durable power of attorney. It gives Sarah full control over your assets if she deems you incapacitated, or if it is in your best financial interest. And let me tell you, selling this land to my development company for $1, so we can leverage the construction loan, that is definitely in your best interest. I looked at Sarah. She was crying openly now. "Dad, the market is crashing. Trey said if we don't sell now, we lose everything. We signed the transfer deed yesterday. The developers are coming tomorrow morning at 8. It is done." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a chassis. I looked around the dining room. The photos on the wall of me and my late wife, Margaret. The photo of Sarah standing next to her first car, a Mustang we built together. The shadows seemed to lengthen, swallowing the history of this house. "You stole it," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "You stole my life while I was trying to recover." "We saved you." Trey slammed his hand on the table, making the wine glasses jump. "You are an ungrateful old man, Cliff. I am offering you a golden parachute. I am going to put $200,000 in an account for you. Do you know how many bingo nights that buys? You should be thanking me. Instead, you are acting like a child holding onto a broken toy." He stood up, buttoning his jacket. He checked his gold watch. "Anyway, dinner is ruined. Come on, Sarah. We have to meet the contractor early. We need to clear the perimeter before the bulldozers arrive." Sarah stood up, wiping her face. She reached out to touch my arm. "Dad, please understand. We will come back tomorrow to help you pack. You can keep a few tools. Just the small ones." "Don't," I said. I pulled my arm away. "Don't touch me." She flinched as if I had slapped her. She looked at Trey, then back at me, and made her choice. She walked to the door, her heels clicking on the hardwood floor, the floor I had sanded and stained myself 30 years ago. Trey stopped in the doorway. He looked back at me, standing alone at the head of a table full of cold food. 8 a.m. "Cliff," he said, "have the keys ready, and do not try anything stupid. The police in this town work for the mayor, and the mayor is an investor in my project. If you are still in that workshop when the crew arrives, I will have you removed for trespassing." The door slammed shut. I heard the beep of his luxury SUV outside, then the crunch of gravel as they drove away. I stood there for a long time. The smell of the turkey was making me nauseous. My chest ached. My hands were trembling, but this time it wasn't from rage. It was from a cold, hollow realization. I was 72 years old. I was a widower. I had a bad heart. And my own daughter had just sold me out for a condo development, and a man who thought a socket wrench was something you downloaded on an iPhone. I walked to the window and looked out into the backyard. The floodlight was on over the workshop. My sanctuary. It wasn't just a shed. It was a cathedral of American steel. Inside that building was a 1967 Shelby GT 500 Super Snake I had been restoring for 3 years. It was a ghost project. No one knew about it. Not even Sarah. Especially not Trey. If they tore that building down tomorrow, they wouldn't just be destroying wood and brick. They would be destroying a piece of history worth more than Trey's entire life. I could call a lawyer, but Trey was right. The courts take months. The bulldozers take minutes. By the time a judge looked at the power of attorney fraud, my shop would be a pile of splinters, and the Shelby would be crushed under falling debris. I felt old. I felt tired. I pulled out a chair and sat down. My hand brushed against my pocket, feeling the outline of my old flip phone. It was a rugged model covered in scratches, the kind that survives drops onto concrete floors. Trey thought I was just a lonely old mechanic. He thought my world ended at the property line. He thought the only people I knew were nurses and other retirees. He forgot that before I was a sick old man, I was the chief. He forgot that for 20 years, every Sunday I opened that workshop to the kids in this town who had nowhere else to go. The dropouts, the troublemakers, the kids with anger issues and dirty hands. I didn't just teach them how to fix carburetors. I taught them how to be men. I taught them code. I pulled out the phone. I didn't scroll through contacts. I didn't need to look up the numbers. I opened a group text that hadn't been used in 5 years. The group name was simply the Sunday Crew. My thumb hovered over the keypad. I could let it go. I could take the money, go to Florida, and die quietly in the sun like Sarah wanted. It would be easier. Then I looked at the demolition order binder on the table. I looked at the gravy stain on my wife's tablecloth. No, I wasn't going to Florida. I typed the message. Short, precise, military, code red. Garage 42, tomorrow 700. Bring the heavy metal. I hit send. I put the phone down and waited. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The house was silent. Maybe they had moved on. Maybe they had changed numbers. Maybe they had forgotten the old man who taught them how to weld. Then the phone buzzed. Once. Solid. On my way. Then again. Roger that, Chief. Then again. And again. And again. The phone started vibrating across the table, dancing against the china plates. It was a continuous hum of incoming messages. 10, 20, 30. I picked up a dinner roll, dipped it in the cold gravy, and took a bite. It was the best Thanksgiving dinner I had ever tasted. Let them come. Let Trey bring his bulldozers. He wanted to clear the site. He had no idea what kind of obstruction he was about to run into. Because tomorrow he wasn't just facing an old man, he was facing the horsepower of Detroit. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark kitchen watching the phone buzz, watching the army I had summoned acknowledge the call. But armies take time to mobilize, and treachery moves at the speed of greed. I must have dozed off in the chair around 4 in the morning, my head resting on the cold granite counter, because the next thing I knew, the world was ending. It was not 8 o'clock. It was 6:02 in the morning. The sound was what woke me first. A low, guttural growl that I recognized instantly. It was the sound of a high-torque diesel engine idling, the kind of sound that usually made my heart sing when it came from a truck engine I had just rebuilt. But this was different. This sound was aggressive. It was accompanied by a vibration that rattled the coffee cups in the drying rack. My house, built on a foundation I had poured myself, was shaking as if a freight train were passing through the living room. I scrambled up my stiff joints, screaming in protest, and ran to the window. The early morning light was gray and cold, a typical Michigan dawn that chilled you to the bone. But the cold was nothing compared to the heat rising in my chest when I saw them. 3 yellow monsters, caterpillar bulldozers. They were not parked on the street. They were on my lawn. Their massive steel tracks had already churned my front yard into a muddy slurry of grass and dirt. The azalea bushes my wife Margaret had planted for our 25th anniversary were gone crushed under tons of yellow steel without a second thought. I didn't even put on my boots. I ran out the back door in my slippers and flannel robe, the cold air biting at my exposed ankles. The smell hit me instantly. Unburnt diesel and raw earth. The smell of destruction. "Hey!" I shouted, waving my arms as I ran toward the workshop. "Stop! You are early! You are 2 hours early!" The lead bulldozer revved its engine, blowing a cloud of black smoke into the sky, drowning out my voice. Standing near the workshop door, looking like a king surveying his conquered kingdom, was Trey. He was wearing a hard hat that looked ridiculous on him, shiny and scuff-free, and a neon safety vest over his expensive Italian suit. Next to him was a man I recognized, and my stomach turned over. Gus. Gus was a building inspector for the county, a man whose neck was wider than his forehead, and who was known in every contractor circle as the guy you called when you wanted problems to disappear for a price. I reached them panting, my breath clouding in the freezing air. "What is this, Trey?" I demanded. "You said 8 o'clock. I have rights. I have time to gather my things." Trey turned to me, his face fresh and shaved, smelling of expensive cologne that clashed with the diesel fumes. "Plans changed, Cliff. We have a tight schedule. Time is money and you are wasting both." He gestured to Gus. The inspector stepped forward holding a staple gun and a bright red piece of paper. With a thud that sounded like a gunshot, he stapled the paper to the solid oak door of my workshop. I looked at it. Condemned. Unsafe structure. Imminent fire hazard. "This is a lie," I spat, turning on Gus. "I wired this shop myself up to code 3 years ago. The beams are reinforced steel. This building could survive a tornado." Gus didn't even look me in the eye. He looked at his clipboard, scribbling something with a bored expression. Section 4, Paragraph 2. Storage of flammable liquids in a residential zone. Inadequate ventilation. Structural fatigue in the roofline. "It is a death trap, Mr. Henderson. I am authorizing an emergency demolition to protect the neighborhood." Emergency demolition. The words rang in my ears. It was a trap, a legal loophole. If they simply wanted to tear it down, I could file an injunction, but I could get a judge to pause it. But if it was declared an immediate safety hazard, they could bypass the courts. They could flatten it right now and apologize later. "You were paid to do this," I said, stepping closer to Gus. "How much did he give you? Was it enough to sell your soul?" Trey stepped between us, his smile gone. "Careful, Cliff. That is slander. Gus is just doing his job. We are protecting you. Imagine if this old shack caught fire while you were inside." My eyes darted to the padlock on the door. The Shelby. The 1967 GT500 Super Snake inside. It was fully disassembled parts on racks, the chassis on the lift. If they knocked the walls down, the roof would collapse right onto the car. It wouldn't just be destroyed. It would be crushed into scrap metal. "I need to get in," I said, my voice shaking. "I need 5 minutes. Just let me get my personal effects. There are things in there that—" No, Trey cut me off. The moment Gus slapped that sticker on the door, this became a restricted zone. No civilians allowed. Insurance policy. Civilians, I built this. I moved. I didn't think, I just reacted. I lunged for the door, my hand reaching for the padlock keys in my robe pocket. I had to get inside. I had to stand in front of that car. If I was inside, they couldn't bulldoze it. They wouldn't kill a man. But I wasn't 20 anymore. And Trey, despite his soft hands, was young and heavy. He stepped sideways and body-checked me. He didn't just block me. He shoved me. Hard. I lost my footing on the loose gravel. My slipper slid, and I went down. My hip hit the frozen ground with a sickening crunch. Pain exploded in my side, radiating down my leg, blinding white-hot pain that made me gasp for air. I lay there in the dirt, the cold seeping into my pajamas, looking up at the sky. I saw the yellow boom of the bulldozer looming over me, like the arm of an executioner. Trey stood over me. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't look concerned. He looked annoyed, like I had spilled a drink on his rug. "Stay down, Cliff," he hissed. "You are trespassing. This property belongs to Caldwell Development now. If you try to enter that building again, I will have the police arrest you. Do you want to spend your retirement in a cell trespassing?" The word tasted like ash. Trespassing on the land where I taught my daughter to ride a bike. Trespassing on the land where I kissed my wife for the last time before the ambulance took her. "Get him off the site," Trey yelled to one of the construction workers. A large man in muddy boots came over, grabbed me by the arm, and hoisted me up. I cried out as my hip protested, but he dragged me half walking, half carrying me toward the street. They threw me out, literally. They hauled me past the property line and left me standing on the public sidewalk. Trey walked to the chain-link fence that had been erected overnight around the perimeter. He pulled a padlock from his pocket and locked the gate. Click. That sound was louder than the engines. It was the sound of finality. I stood there shivering, holding my side, watching through the diamond-shaped holes of the fence. My house looked alien. My workshop looked small and vulnerable against the massive machines. Then Trey did something that made my blood run cold. He pulled out his phone. He held it up, adjusting his hair in the reflection of the screen. He put on a wide, winning smile, the kind that won him awards at the Rotary Club. "Good morning, everyone," he shouted at the phone, turning his back to me. "We are live from the site of the new Caldwell Plaza. It is a beautiful morning for progress. Behind me, we are clearing away the old to make room for the future. Look at that eyesore go." He pointed the camera at my workshop. He didn't show the old man shivering in a bathrobe on the sidewalk. He didn't show the red tag that was a lie. He only showed the narrative he wanted the world to see. The successful developer cleaning up the neighborhood. I looked down the street. It was 6:15. The sun was just starting to crest over the trees. The street was empty. Quiet. My heart sank. Had the text message failed? Had they ignored me, maybe Trey was right. Maybe I was just a dinosaur roaring at a meteor that had already hit. The lead bulldozer engaged its gears. The tracks clanked as it turned, positioning its massive blade toward the front console of my shop. The driver revved the engine, black smoke pouring out, signaling he was ready to strike. Trey gave a thumbs up to the driver. "Do it," he mouthed. I closed my eyes. I couldn't watch. I couldn't watch 50 years of my life turn to dust. I gripped the cold steel of the fence until my fingers turned white, waiting for the crash of timber and the scream of twisting metal. But the crash didn't come. Instead, I felt it. A vibration in the soles of my slippers, faint at first like a distant thunder, then stronger. It wasn't the jagged mechanical rattle of the bulldozers. This was a smooth, rhythmic thrum, a bass note that resonated in your chest cavity. I opened my eyes. The bulldozer driver had paused. He was looking up toward the end of the street. Trey had stopped his live stream, his phone lowered, a confused frown on his face. The sound grew louder. It wasn't one engine. It was many, a symphony of pistons and exhaust. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated American horsepower. I turned my head to the left, then to the right. And there, turning the corner at the end of the block, the morning sun glinting off its cherry-red hood, was a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro SS. Following it bumper to bumper was a black Dodge Charger, then a Pontiac GTO, then a Mustang Fastback. They were coming, the Sunday crew. And they weren't just bringing cars. They were bringing a war. I walked for 3 blocks before my legs gave out. The adrenaline that had surged through me when I tried to rush the workshop door was fading, replaced by a throbbing ache in my hip where I had hit the frozen ground. I found myself in front of Maureen's diner, a place where the neon sign flickered with a comforting buzz that I had known for 40 years. I limped inside the bell above the door, announcing my defeat. The air smelled of burnt coffee and bacon grease, a stark contrast to the diesel fumes and raw earth smell that now choked my property. I slid into a booth at the back, away from the window, away from the prying eyes of the town that was just waking up. Maureen came over with a pot of black coffee before I even asked. She saw the mud on my robe, the scrape on my cheek, but she was a woman of the Rust Belt. She knew better than to ask a man why he looked like he had been in a fight before the sun came up. She just poured the coffee, left a napkin, and walked away. I wrapped my hands around the ceramic mug, trying to stop the trembling. It was not the cold, it was the terror. A specific gnawing terror that had nothing to do with losing the land or the workshop walls. Trey called my shop a shack. Sarah called it a storage unit for junk. They saw rusted fenders and oil-stained concrete. They did not know what was actually inside. They did not know about the beast sleeping under the canvas tarp in the back bay. I closed my eyes, and I could see it perfectly in my mind. The 1967 Shelby GT 500 Super Snake. It was not just a car. It was a ghost, a unicorn. History books said only one was ever made, a white fastback with a 42.7 racing engine that could hit 170 miles per hour. But there was a rumor of a second chassis, a prototype that never made it to the showroom floor. 10 years ago, I found it rotting in a collapsed barn in Oklahoma. I bought it for cash, hauled it back in the dead of night, and spent the last decade hunting down the correct parts. It was my retirement fund. It was my legacy. The engine block alone was worth more than Trey's luxury SUV. When finished, that car would fetch over $2 million at auction. Enough to secure my future. Enough to help Sarah if she ever came to her senses. And now it was sitting on jack stands, the engine hoist attached, completely vulnerable. If a bulldozer knocked down the load-bearing wall, the roof trusses would snap. Thousands of pounds of timber and shingles would rain down on that aluminum engine block. It would turn a masterpiece into a twisted pile of scrap metal. I had to tell her. I had to make her understand. I pulled the flip phone from my pocket again. My thumb hovered over the keypad. Calling the police would take too long. Filing an injunction would take days. I needed to stop them now. I needed to beg if I had to. A father should never have to beg his child for mercy, but pride does not save transmissions. I dialed Sarah's number. It rang once, twice, 3 times. I pictured her standing in the driveway looking at the house she grew up in, maybe feeling a twinge of guilt. "Hello?" Her voice was tight, breathless. "Sarah," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Do not hang up, please." "Dad, I cannot talk right now. Trey is really upset. You caused a scene. The neighbors are watching." "I do not care about the neighbors, Sarah. Listen to me very carefully. You have to stop the demolition, not for the building, for what is inside. We went over this, Dad. We will box up your tools. Trey said he would hire movers to put everything in a storage unit next week." "Next week will be too late," I said, leaning forward, whispering intensely into the phone. "Sarah, there is a car in the back bay, under the gray tarp. It is not just a car. It is a Shelby. It is worth millions. You cannot let them touch the structure. If the roof comes down, it destroys the engine." There was a silence on the other end. For a second, I thought I had reached her. I thought the dollar signs might wake her up where my pleas for sentiment had failed. $1 million, Sarah asked, her voice skeptical. "Dad, come on. You have been saying that junk is gold for years. It is just old metal." "It is not junk," I pleaded. "It is a super snake. Look it up. Please, Sarah. Just go in there, take the key, open the door and look. If you see that car, you will know I am telling the truth. Just stop the machines for 10 minutes. I heard her sigh. It was a long, exasperated sound, that signaled she was talking to a stubborn child, not her father. "Okay, Dad. Okay. I hear you. I will tell Trey. We will make sure they are careful. We will get the car out first. I promise. Just stay at the hotel, okay? Do not come back here and make it worse." Relief washed over me. It was weak, but it was there. She promised. She was my daughter. She might be misguided, she might be manipulated, but she was not a monster. She wouldn't destroy something if she knew its value. "Thank you, baby," I said, feeling tears prick my eyes. "Thank you. Just make sure they use the flatbed. Do not tow it. The drive shaft is disconnected." "I know, Dad. I know. I have to go." She did not hang up immediately. She lowered the phone thinking she had ended the call, but the connection stayed open. And in that technological glitch, in that split second of digital negligence, my world shattered. I heard the crunch of gravel. I heard the roar of the diesel engine idling nearby. And I heard Trey's voice. It was loud, clear, and dripping with venom. "Who was that?" Trey asked. "My dad," Sarah replied. Her voice sounded different now. Dismissive. Cold. "He is hysterical. He keeps talking about some $1 million car inside the shop. He wants us to stop and check." I held the phone tighter, pressing it against my ear until it hurt. I waited for her to defend me. I waited for her to say, maybe we should look. Instead, I heard Trey laugh. A cruel, barking laugh. Of course he does. He will say anything to stall us. He probably hid cash in the walls or something stupid. "Listen to me, Sarah. We are behind schedule. Gus says the foundation inspector is coming at noon. We need this site leveled flat by then." "But what if there is something valuable?" Sarah asked. Trey snorted. "The only thing valuable in there is the copper wiring, and the meth heads probably stripped that years ago. Look, do you want this condo project or not? Do you want the life I promised you, because that life requires this land to be empty?" "I want it," Sarah said softly. "Then tell the foreman to proceed," Trey commanded. "And tell the operator to hit the back wall first. That is where the structural weakness is. Bring the roof down on top of it. It saves us time on debris removal if it is all crushed together. We will scoop it all up into dumpsters and sort it at the landfill." "No," I whispered to the empty diner. "No." Sarah's voice came through one last time, faint but clear. "Okay. Crush it. Just get it over with." The line went dead. I sat there with the phone pressed to my ear, was listening to the dial tone. It sounded like a flat line. The waitress, Maureen, walked by and refilled my coffee cup. She looked at me, paused, and then put a hand on my shoulder. "You okay, Cliff? You look like you just saw a ghost." I slowly lowered the phone and closed it with a snap. I didn't look at her. I looked at the reflection of my face in the dark window. I saw an old man, a man who had spent his life fixing things. Broken engines, broken toys, broken hearts. I had spent 28 years trying to fix Sarah, trying to fill the hole her mother left, trying to give her everything so she would never feel lack. And in doing so, I had broken her. I had raised a woman who could look at her father's life work and order it to be crushed because a man in a shiny suit told her to. The sadness evaporated. The grief that had been weighing down my chest simply vanished. In its place, something cold and hard formed. It felt like steel. It felt like the iron block of a 427 engine. They were not just going to destroy a building. They were going to erase me. They were going to crush the Shelby, mix it with drywall and insulation, and cart it off to a landfill like garbage. Trey knew exactly what he was doing. He didn't care about the car. He wanted the destruction. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted to show me that my era was over, that my hands were useless against his money. I looked down at the coffee. It was black. Bitter. Just the way I liked it. I drank it in one gulp, ignoring the burn. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a $10 bill, leaving it on the table. I am fine, Maureen, I said. My voice surprised me. It was steady. It was deep. It was the voice I used to use when I ran the pit crew at the local speedway. I am better than fine. I just realized something. What is that, Hon? She asked. I realized that being a nice guy does not work when you are dealing with wolves. I stood up. The pain in my hip was still there, but I shoved it aside. I walked out of the diner not with the shuffle of a defeated pensioner, but with the stride of a man who had work to do. I walked to the payphone outside even though I had my cell. I needed a landline. I needed a connection that couldn't be traced or interrupted. I needed to make a call that wasn't to family. I had tried peace. I had tried logic. I had tried begging. Now I was going to try torque. I picked up the receiver and punched in a number I hadn't called in years. It wasn't the Sunday crew yet. That would come later. This was the first step. This was the reconnaissance. A voice answered on the second ring. Dusty. Dry. The voice of a man who lived in the archives of the county clerk's office. Records department, the voice said. Hello, Milton, I said. It is Cliff Henderson. Cliff, haven't heard from you since the drag strip closed. What can I do for you? I need you to pull a file for me, Milton. I need the original zoning maps for 42 Oak Street. Not the digital ones. The original microfiche from 1920. And Milton, yeah, Cliff, look for the historical designation overlay. Specifically, the clause about pre-war industrial heritage sites. There was a pause. I heard the clicking of a keyboard, then the rustling of paper. Cliff, you know those files are archived in the basement. It would take me an hour to find them. And why would you care? I thought you were selling. I am not selling, Milton. I am going to war, and I need ammunition. I heard Milton chuckle. It was a dry, dusty sound. All right, Cliff. Give me an hour. If there is a clause hidden in that deed, I will find it. But Cliff, yeah. If you are going up against Caldwell Development, you are going to need more than a piece of paper. They play dirty. I know, I said, looking down the street toward the rising sun. That is why I am not playing by their rules anymore. I hung up the phone. I looked at my watch. 7:15. I had 45 minutes before the bank opened. I had 12 hours before the real heavy hitters of the Sunday crew could mobilize. I had to buy time. And I knew exactly how to do it. I wasn't going to beg Sarah again. I wasn't going to plead with Trey. I was going to use the one thing they thought I was too old to understand. I was going to use the law, but not their law. I was going to use the law of the street. I walked back to my truck, which was parked around the block. It was an old Ford F-250, rusted in the wheel wells but mechanically perfect. I climbed in, turned the key, and felt the engine roar to life. Trey wanted to clear the site. He wanted to remove the obstacles. Well, he was about to discover that some obstacles fight back. I put the truck in gear and drove toward the hardware store. I needed chains, I needed padlocks, and I needed the biggest can of spray paint they had. The time for talking was over. The time for the heavy metal was just beginning. The neon sign of the Starlight Motel flickered with a rhythmic buzzing hum that sounded like a dying insect. I sat on the edge of the mattress, which sagged in the middle like a hammock, and stared at the beige carpet stained with years of neglect. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and lemon pledge, a chemical attempt to mask the scent of despair. I was 72 years old. I had worked every day since I was 16. I had paid my taxes. I had served my country. I had raised a family. And yet here I was, sitting in a $40 a night motel room on the edge of town with nothing but a duffel bag of clothes and a toothbrush. My home, the house where I had carried my wife over the threshold, was now a restricted zone. My workshop, the cathedral of my life's work, was on death row. I leaned back against the headboard and closed my eyes. The pain in my hip from where Trey had shoved me was a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder of my physical limitations. For a moment, a dark thought crept into my mind. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I was just a stubborn old fool fighting a war I had already lost. I could take the money. I could go to Florida. I could sit on a porch and watch the ocean and pretend that I didn't care about the smell of gasoline or the sound of a ratchet wrench. It would be easier. It would be safe. But then I remembered the look on Trey's face. That smirk. That arrogant, dismissive smirk that said I was nothing but an obstacle to be bulldozed. He didn't just want my land. He wanted to erase my history. And he had used my own daughter to do it. I opened my eyes. The despair was still there, but underneath it, the ember of anger was glowing brighter. I wasn't going to Florida. Not yet. I stood up wincing as my hip popped and walked out of the room. The night air was crisp, filled with the distant sound of highway traffic. I walked over to my Ford F-250. It was parked under a flickering street lamp, looking like a scarred beast resting between battles. This truck was my mobile office. It was where I kept the things that mattered. I unlocked the door and reached behind the bench seat. My hand brushed against the cold metal of a tire iron before finding what I was looking for. A long cardboard tube capped at both ends. I pulled it out and carried it back into the motel room. I swept the brochures and the remote control off the small laminate table and popped the cap off the tube. I slid out a roll of paper that smelled of old dust and ammonia. These were the original blueprints and survey maps of my property. I had kept them for 40 years, ever since I bought the land from the widow of a railway tycoon. Back then they used real surveying equipment, not satellites. They used chains and iron stakes driven deep into the Michigan clay. I pinned the corners of the map down with the motel ice bucket and a Bible. I turned on the bedside lamp and pulled out my reading glasses. Then I took out my phone. I opened the photo gallery and zoomed in on the picture I had snapped of Trey's binder during dinner before the chaos started. It was a blurry image of his site plan, but the numbers were legible. I started comparing. My finger traced the property line on the old blue paper. According to the 1982 deed, my lot was a rectangular parcel 150 feet wide by 200 feet deep. The western boundary was marked by an old oak tree that had been cut down 10 years ago, and the eastern boundary ran parallel to the city drainage easement. I looked at the photo of Trey's plan. Lot 42, it read. Proposed dimensions 180 feet wide by 200 feet deep. I frowned. I cleaned my glasses and looked again. 180 feet. Where did he get the extra 30 feet? I went back to the old map. The 30 feet to the east of my property wasn't land. It was a utility easement. A no-man's land owned by the city for sewer access. You couldn't build on it. You couldn't buy it. It was public infrastructure. My heart started to beat faster, not from fear, but from the thrill of the hunt. I looked closer at Trey's digital rendering. The proposed condo complex was massive. 6 units. To fit 6 units and meet the county code for parking and fire access, he needed a minimum lot width of 175 feet. If he only had my 150 feet, he could only build 4 units. 4 units meant 33% less profit. 4 units meant the bank probably wouldn't have approved the loan size he needed to cover his gambling debts or whatever hole he had dug himself into. I realized then what I was looking at. It wasn't just an error. It was fraud. Trey had redrawn the property lines on his proposal. He had absorbed the city easement into my lot to artificially inflate the acreage. He had lied to the investors. He had lied to the zoning board. And most importantly, had lied to the bank. I sat back in the creaky chair, a dry chuckle escaping my lips. He was greedy. That was his flaw. He wasn't satisfied with stealing my land. He had to steal the city's land too, just to squeeze out a few more dollars. I grabbed a notepad from the nightstand and started doing the math. Mortgage fraud. Falsifying federal documents. If I could prove this, the demolition order wouldn't just be paused, it would be voided. The bank would pull the funding immediately. The project would die before the first brick was laid. But knowing it and proving it were two different things. I had a 40-year-old piece of paper. Trey had a team of lawyers and a crooked inspector named Gus, who had probably signed off on the fake survey. If I walked into the city council meeting tomorrow with just this map, they would laugh at me. They would say my data was obsolete. They would say modern GPS surveys were more accurate. I needed undeniable proof. I needed to find the original iron stakes buried in the ground. I looked at the clock. It was nearly midnight. The demolition was scheduled for 8 a.m., but Trey had started early today. He might try to finish the job before sunrise tomorrow to destroy the evidence. If they bulldozed the land, they would dig up the stakes. They would regrade the soil. They would erase the physical boundary markers forever. I felt a surge of urgency. I had the weapon, but I needed the soldiers. I couldn't dig up the property line by myself in the dark, not with a bad hip and private security guarding the fence. I needed witnesses. I needed people who carried weight in this town. I looked at the phone again. The Sunday crew. I had already sent the signal. They were coming for a fight to block the bulldozers with brute force. But now I could give them something better than a fistfight. I could give them a legal execution. I picked up the pen and wrote down a list of names. Not just mechanics. I thought about who those boys had grown up to be. Billy Piston Miller. He was the sheriff now. Thomas Sparky Paxson. He was a circuit court judge. And there was one more. The most important one. The kid who used to sweep my floors in exchange for learning how to balance a checkbook. Arthur Wallace. Arthur was the quiet one. The one who didn't like getting grease on his hands, but loved the precision of an engine. He went to business school. He became a banker. I pulled up the local business directory on my phone. First National Bank of Michigan. President Arthur Wallace. I stared at the screen. First National was the bank financing the Caldwell Plaza project. I had seen the logo on the binder. Trey had borrowed money from my former student to destroy my shop using fraudulent documents. The irony was so sweet, I could taste it. I wasn't helpless anymore. I wasn't just an old man in a motel room. I was the holder of the truth. I stood up and walked to the window, pulling back the curtain. I looked toward the direction of my house. I couldn't see it from here, but I knew it was there waiting for me. "Sleep well, Trey," I whispered to the darkness. "Enjoy your victory lap, because tomorrow morning you are not just going to lose a construction site. You are going to lose your freedom." I folded the map carefully and put it back in the tube. I washed my face in the small sink, scrubbing away the grime and the pity. When I looked in the mirror, the tired old man was gone. The eyes staring back were sharp. They were the eyes of a master mechanic who had just figured out exactly why the engine was knocking and exactly which bolt to turn to fix it. I lay down on the bed, fully dressed, boots on. I closed my eyes, but this time I didn't see the bulldozer. I saw the look on Trey's face when the house of cards he built came crashing down. I waited for the sun. The longest night of my life was almost over, and the morning was going to be loud. A knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. It was a hesitant sound, 3 soft raps that barely rose above the hum of the motel air conditioner. I knew who it was before I even turned the handle. Only one person knew I was staying at the Starlight. I opened the door and found Sarah standing under the flickering yellow bulb of the walkway. She looked exhausted. Her makeup was smudged and she was hugging her expensive cashmere coat around herself, as if she were freezing even though the night air had settled into a mild stillness. In her hand she clutched a small white envelope. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I stepped aside without a word. She walked into the cramped room, her eyes scanning the peeling wallpaper, the stained carpet, and the single unmade bed. She wrinkled her nose slightly, a reflex she probably didn't even notice. It hurt more than a slap. It was the same look her mother used to give me when I came home with grease under my fingernails after a 12-hour shift. "It is not much, but it is clean enough," I said, closing the door. "Dad, this place is awful," she said, turning to face me. "You don't have to stay here. Trey and we talked. We can get you a room at the Marriott until the assisted living paperwork goes through." I sat down on the edge of the bed, my bad hip throbbing. "I don't want your charity, Sarah. I want my house." She sighed a long, shuddering breath and sat on the only chair in the room. She placed the envelope on the small table between us. It sat there like a loaded gun. "I came to bring you this," she said. I looked at it. "What is it, Pinponawunit?" I reached out and picked up the envelope. My hands were steady now. The trembling from the morning had been replaced by a cold resolve. I tore the flap open and pulled out a thin strip of paper. It was a personal check, signed by Trey Caldwell. The amount was written in his jagged, arrogant handwriting. $5,000. For a moment, I just stared at it. I tried to process the number. 5,000. "This is in advance," Sarah said quickly, seeing my expression. Trey spoke to the scrap metal guys. He estimates the salvage value of the materials in the workshop is around 10,000. He wanted to give you half up front, so you can buy some new clothes, maybe get a new phone. I looked up at her. I felt a laugh building in my chest, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was dark and jagged. $5,000, I repeated. "That is what you think 40 years of my life is worth. That is the price of the tools I used to build your first swing set. That is the price of the roof that sheltered you. Dad, be reasonable. It is just old metal. Trey is being generous. He didn't have to give you anything. The deed is already transferred." Generous. I stood up, the check crumpled in my fist. "He is buying my silence, Sarah. He is throwing crumbs at me so he can feel better about stealing the whole cake. And you? You are the one delivering the crumbs. I am trying to help you," she shouted, standing up to meet me. Her facade cracked. The cool, detached demeanor she had worn at dinner vanished, replaced by the petulant anger of a child caught in a lie. "You think this is easy for me? You think I want to put you in a home?" "We have no choice, Dad." "There is always a choice," I said. "You chose him. You chose the condo project over your own father." "We need the money," she screamed. The words hung in the air, vibrating in the silence that followed. She clamped a hand over her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. She hadn't meant to say it. I lowered my hand. The anger in my chest cooled into something sharper. Curiosity. "You need the money?" I asked softly. "But Trey is a successful developer. He drives a Porsche. He wears Italian suits. Why does he need the money from a teardown project so badly?" Sarah sank back into the chair, burying her face in her hands. Her shoulders shook. When she spoke, her voice was muffled by tears. "He is in trouble, Dad. Real trouble." I sat back down on the bed, leaning forward. "Tell me." "He owes people," she sobbed. "Not the bank. Bad people. He made some bad bets on sports. Then he tried to cover it with crypto investments, but everything crashed. He is underwater, Dad. Deep. $300,000. I listened, and the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The rush to demolish. The fraudulent survey map. The desperation to bypass the permit process. Trey wasn't a visionary builder. He was a drowning man, and he was using my property as a life raft. "So that is it," I said, my voice flat. "He is not building condos to improve the neighborhood. He is building them to pay off bookies, and he is using your inheritance to do it." "He promised it would work," Sarah pleaded, looking up at me with mascara running down her cheeks. "He said if we can just get the land cleared, The bank releases the first draw of the construction loan. We can pay off the debts. We can start fresh. But we need that loan, Dad. And the bank won't release a cent until the site is clear. That is why tomorrow is so important. I looked at the crumpled check in my hand. $5,000. It was probably the last of his cash, a desperate bribe to keep the old man quiet. And you believed him, I asked. You believed that a man who gambles away his own money is going to be careful with yours. I love him, Dad. He is just going through a rough patch. I stood up and walked to the trash can. I smoothed out the check, held it up so she could see it, and then slowly, deliberately, I tore it in half, then in half again. I let the pieces flutter into the bin like confetti. Dad, what are you doing? That is $5,000. I am doing what I should have done years ago, I said. I am letting you face the consequences of your actions. I turned to her. My heart was breaking, but my face was stone. I am not taking his money, and I am not letting him take my land to pay for his mistakes. If he is in debt, let him sell his Porsche. Let him sell his suits. But he is not selling my legacy. You don't understand, Sarah stood up, wiping her face aggressively. If he doesn't pay them by next week, they will hurt him. Then he should call the police, I said. But he won't, will he? Because then they would find out about the fraud, about the fake survey, about the power of attorney you signed while I was unconscious. She froze. How do you know about that? I know enough, I said. Go home, Sarah. She stared at me for a long moment. The sadness in her eyes hardened into something cold. She grabbed her coat and pulled it tight like armor. Fine, she spat. Be stubborn. Be the hero. But when the bulldozers start rolling at 7 a.m., don't come crying to me. We are tearing that shop down, Dad, with or without your permission. And if you try to stop us, Trey has security. You will just get hurt again. She walked to the door and yanked it open. The night air rushed in cold and biting. Everything will be gone by noon, she said, her back to me. The cars, the tools, the memories. You are going to lose it all, Dad. And you will have no one to blame but yourself. She slammed the door. I stared at the wood grain, listening to her footsteps fade away into the parking lot. I heard her car engine start, then tires screeching as she peeled out onto the highway. I was alone again. I looked at the trash can where the torn check lay. $5,000. It was an insult, yes, but it was also a confession. It told me everything I needed to know. Trey was scared. He was desperate, and desperate men make mistakes. He thought he was racing against a deadline to pay off his debts. He didn't know he was racing against me. I checked my watch. It was 2 a.m. 5 hours left. I picked up my phone. I had one more message to send. Not to the crew this time, but to the man who would lead them. I typed out the text to Sheriff Miller. Game time, Billy. Bring the cuffs. I lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. I didn't sleep. I just visualized the morning. I visualized the look on Sarah's face when she realized that the man she was trying to save was dragging her down with him. It was going to hurt her. It was going to break her heart. But sometimes you have to break a bone to reset it properly. I closed my eyes and waited for the dawn. The heavy metal was coming, and I was ready to conduct the symphony. I sat in the silence that Sarah left behind. The motel room felt smaller now, suffocating, but my mind was expanding, reaching out beyond these 4 beige walls. I looked at the old flip phone in my hand. It was a relic taped together at the hinge with black electrical tape, the keys worn down so smooth you had to know the numbers by heart, because the ink had faded years ago. Trey had laughed at it once. He called it a dinosaur. He didn't understand that some things are built to last. Some things are built to survive the drop. I opened the contact list. It was short. I am not a man who collects acquaintances. I collect loyalty. And I was about to cash in the biggest policy of my life. I scrolled down to a group saved simply as Sunday. To anyone else, it looked like a list of random numbers, but to me it was a roll call of saved lives. 20 years ago, this town was different. The factories were closing, the opioids were moving in, and the streets were full of kids with too much anger and nowhere to put it. They were the throwaways, the ones the teachers sat in the back of the class, the ones the cops knew by name before they were old enough to drive. I didn't open a youth center with ping-pong tables. I opened my garage doors. I put a sign out front that said, "If you help me sweep, I will teach you how to weld. If you help me sort bolts, I will teach you how to rebuild a carburetor." They came in slow at first, suspicious, hands deep in their pockets, eyes darting around looking for the angle. They expected a lecture. They expected judgment. Instead, I gave them a wrench. I gave them a task. I told them that an engine does not care where you come from. It does not care if your dad is in prison or if your mom is never home. An engine only cares about truth. If you treat it right, if you respect the tolerances, if you tighten the bolts to the exact torque spec, it will run. It will sing. I taught them that control wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. Control was understanding how things worked. Control was patience. Control was taking a broken, rusted pile of metal that the world had given up on and turning it into something powerful, something beautiful. I remember one kid, skinny as a rail, eyes wild like a cornered animal. He had stolen a car and crashed it. The judge gave him a choice: juvie or community service with the crazy mechanic on Oak Street. He chose me. The first day he threw a wrench through my window because he couldn't get a bolt loose. I didn't yell. I didn't call his parole officer. I just picked up the wrench, handed it back to him, and showed him how to use leverage instead of force. That kid is the one I texted first tonight. I looked at the glowing screen. My thumb hovered over the keypad. It had been 5 years since we had all been together. Life happens. They grew up. They moved on. They became successful men with families and mortgages and reputations to protect. Maybe they had forgotten the smell of the shop. Maybe they had forgotten the old man who taught them that grease washes off, but integrity doesn't. But I had to try. Because tomorrow morning I wasn't just fighting for a building. I was fighting for the very place that had saved them. If Trey bulldozed that garage, he wasn't just crushing wood and brick. He was crushing the sanctuary where these boys became men. I typed the message. It was short. We didn't do long goodbyes or emotional hellos in the shop. We spoke in codes. We spoke in actions. Code red. That was the signal. We only used it once before, when the river flooded in '98, and we had to move every car in the shop to high ground in the middle of the night. It meant all hands on deck. It meant drop everything. Garage 42. They knew the address. They knew it better than their own childhood homes. Tomorrow, 700. The 0 hour. The time the enemy threatened to strike. Bring the heavy metal. I paused. Heavy metal didn't just mean music. In our language, it meant muscle cars. It meant the big blocks, the 454s, the Hemis. It meant bring the loudest, strongest, most intimidating piece of machinery you own. It was a call to intimidate, a call to show force. I pressed send. The little icon spun for a second, then disappeared, sent to 32 recipients. I put the phone down on the nightstand and waited. The room was dead silent. I could hear the refrigerator humming in the corner. I could hear my own heartbeat slow and heavy. Doubt started to creep in. It was late. Maybe they were asleep. Maybe they had changed their numbers. Maybe they would see the text and think crazy old Cliff is at it again. Why would a banker, a judge, a sheriff risk their careers for an old mechanic? Trey was powerful. Trey had the mayor in his pocket. These men had everything to lose. 1 minute passed, then 2. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the water stains. Maybe I was alone. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe the world had moved on and left me behind a stubborn relic clinging to a past that nobody cared about anymore. Then the phone buzzed. It was a short, sharp vibration against the wood of the table. I picked it up. A message from a number I hadn't saved, but I recognized the area code. Copy that, Chief. Standing by. My throat tightened. Chief. Nobody had called me that in years. Then another buzz. Roger. On my way. Then another. Message received. Do I need the tow truck or just the GTO? I smiled. Just the GTO, son. We are not towing anything. We are planting a flag. The phone started to dance on the table. It buzzed and vibrated in a continuous rhythm like an engine catching fire. Received. Affirmative. See you at dawn, Chief. Locked and loaded. Tell them to say their prayers. They were answering. All of them. From the city, from the suburbs, maybe even from the next county over. They weren't asking why. They weren't asking if it was legal. They weren't asking if I was drunk or senile. I said code red and they answered. Because that is what we do, we show up. I read through the messages, tears blurring my vision for the first time that night. I saw names attached to the numbers in my memory. There was the kid who used to steal hubcaps, who now ran the biggest logistics company in the state. There was the boy who stuttered so bad he couldn't speak, who found his voice in the roar of an engine, now a top litigator in Detroit. They remembered. They remembered the late nights when we stayed up fixing a transmission, just so a single mom could get to work the next day. They remembered the time I paid for their GED tests. They remembered that the workshop wasn't just a building. It was the only place in the world where they were judged by their work, not their past. And now they were coming back to defend it. I watched the messages slow down, the roster filling up. 32 men. 32 machines. I finally put the phone down. The anxiety that had been eating at my stomach all day dissolved. The pain in my hip faded into the background. I felt a calm settle over me, heavy and warm like a wool blanket. Trey had his bulldozers. He had his permits. He had his hired goons and his corrupt inspectors. He thought he had the leverage. He thought he was waking up tomorrow to crush a helpless old man. He had no idea. He was about to wake up to a reunion. I took off my boots, setting them neatly by the door. I lay back on the pillow, my hands clasped behind my head. For the first time in a week, my mind turned off. I didn't worry about the mortgage fraud. I didn't worry about the zoning laws. I didn't even worry about Sarah. She would learn her lesson tomorrow just like the rest of them. I closed my eyes and listened to the silence of the room, knowing that it was the last quiet moment I would have for a while. Tomorrow, the air would shake. Tomorrow, the ground would tremble. I slept. I slept deep and dreamless, the sleep of a general who knows his reinforcements have arrived. The sleep of a man who knows that when the sun comes up, he won't be standing alone. The sun rose over Oak Street like a bruised eye, casting a pale, sickly light on the destruction that was about to unfold. I stood on the opposite sidewalk, my hands buried deep in the pockets of my canvas work jacket, feeling the cold steel of my watch against my wrist. It was 6:30 in the morning, but the noise was already deafening. The air didn't smell like dew and morning coffee anymore. It smelled of unburnt diesel, stale sweat, and the acrid metallic tang of impending violence. Trey had transformed my front yard into a war zone. Yesterday, there had been 3 bulldozers. Today, there were 5. They sat in a semicircle around the perimeter of the fence, their engines idling, with a low, bone-rattling thrum that vibrated through the soles of my boots. But the machines were not the only addition to the scene. Trey had hired muscle. Standing at 10-foot intervals along the chain-link fence were men in black tactical gear. They wore sunglasses despite the gray dawn and had earpieces coiled behind their ears. They stood with their arms crossed, chests puffed out, trying to look like Secret Service agents. But I knew the type. These were rent-a-cops. Failed academy cadets and bounced bouncers who liked the feeling of authority a little too much. They weren't there to protect the site. They were there to intimidate me, to make sure the old man didn't try anything stupid, like throwing his body in front of the tracks again. I saw the neighbors peeking out from behind their curtains. Mrs. Gable from next door stepped out onto her porch in her bathrobe, looking terrified. One of the security guards immediately pointed a gloved finger at her and barked something I couldn't hear. She flinched and hurried back inside. Trey wasn't just clearing a lot. He was occupying the neighborhood. And there he was, the commander of this pathetic little army. Trey stood on the bed of a pickup truck parked right in front of the main gate. He had traded his suit jacket for a pristine, stiff construction jacket that looked like it had just come out of the packaging. In one hand, he held a megaphone. In the other, his smartphone mounted on a stabilizer gimbal. He was filming, again. I watched him fix his hair in the reflection of the screen flash, that blinding capped tooth smile, and start talking to his invisible audience. I couldn't hear his exact words over the roar of the engines, but I knew the script. He was the hero. I was the villain. He was progress. I was the past. Then I saw her. Sarah was standing near the front of the truck. She looked small, fragile. She was wearing a heavy wool coat and hugging a thermos of coffee like it was a life preserver. She wasn't looking at the camera. She wasn't looking at the workshop. She was looking at her boots kicking at a loose piece of gravel. For a second, I felt a surge of hope. Maybe she would look up. Maybe she would see me standing there, exiled on the pavement, and remember who taught her to walk. Maybe she would run over, grab the megaphone, and stop this madness. I took a step forward, just to see if she would react. One of the guards stepped into my path instantly. He was a mountain of a man with a neck tattoo and eyes that looked like dead shark eyes. "Back it up, Pops," he grunted. "This is a restricted area." I looked him up and down. I didn't back up. I didn't blink. "I am standing on public property, son," I said, my voice low and steady. "Unless you own the sidewalk, get out of my face." He smirked, leaning down so his breath smelling of stale tobacco hit my face. "Don't make me earn my bonus early. The boss said if you cross the curb, we put you on the ground. And at your age, I don't think you bounce back up." I looked past him, locking eyes with Trey. He had noticed the commotion. He lowered his phone and raised the megaphone to his lips. The electronic screech of feedback sliced through the morning air, making everyone wince. "Good morning, Cliff." Trey's amplified voice boomed across the street, bouncing off the siding of the neighboring houses. "So glad you could join us for the show. I hope you brought tissues." He laughed, a distorted metallic sound. "I see you are admiring the security," he continued. "Just a precaution. We wouldn't want you hurting yourself trying to save your pile of rusty garbage." "Safety first, right?" I didn't respond. I just stood there, a statue in a flannel shirt. To anyone watching, I must have looked pathetic. A lonely, defeated old man staring down a multi-million-dollar operation. I saw the pity in the eyes of the construction workers. They looked at their boots, uncomfortable with the cruelty of it all. They were working men. They knew what a workshop meant to a man. But they had mortgages to pay, and Trey signed the checks. Trey jumped down from the truck and walked over to Sarah. He put his arm around her shoulder, pulling her close. It looked like a hug, but I saw the way his fingers dug into the fabric of her coat. It wasn't affection. It was possession. He whispered something in her ear, and she nodded, stiff and jerky. He pointed the megaphone at me again. "Last chance to walk away, Cliff," he taunted. "Go back to the motel. Go have a nice breakfast. You don't want to watch this. It is going to be messy." I checked my watch. 6:45. 15 minutes. I looked up at the sky. It was brightening. The clouds were breaking. The timing had to be perfect. If the crew arrived too early, Trey might call the real police and claim harassment. If they arrived too late, the front wall would be gone. I needed to hold him here. I needed to let him think he had won. I finally spoke. I didn't have a megaphone, but I had the voice of a man who had shouted orders over the roar of dyno testing engines for 40 years. "You are a coward, Trey," I yelled. The word cut through the diesel rumble. Trey stiffened. He lowered the megaphone, his face twisting in anger. "You hide behind fences," I continued. "You hide behind guards. You hide behind my daughter. You are not a builder. You are a demolition man. Because destroying things is easy. Building things takes a man." Trey's face went red. I had hit the nerve. I had embarrassed him in front of his employees, in front of the camera. He marched back to the pickup truck and scrambled up to the bed, grabbing the megaphone again. "You want to talk about being a man?" he screamed, his voice cracking. "A man provides. A man knows when to let go. You are just a hoarder holding onto a graveyard." He turned to the lead bulldozer, a massive machine with a blade the size of a billboard. "Fire it up," Trey commanded. "Full throttle." The driver hesitated. It wasn't 7:00 yet. "I said, move it!" Trey shrieked. "Take down the gate. I want that entrance wide open." The driver shrugged and pulled the lever. The engine roared, a plume of black smoke shooting into the sky. The tracks clanked and squealed as the machine lurched forward. The metal gate of my workshop was 12 feet wide, welded from solid steel tubing. I had built it myself to keep thieves out. It was strong, but it wasn't built to stop 30 tons of hydraulic force. Sarah finally looked up. She put her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She took a step toward the machine, but Trey grabbed her arm and yanked her back. "Watch," he hissed loud enough for me to hear. "Watch your inheritance being secured." The blade of the bulldozer made contact. The sound was excruciating. It wasn't a crash. It was a scream. The sound of metal being tortured bent beyond its yield point. The steel tubing groaned, then buckled. The hinges shrieked as they were ripped from the concrete pillars. I flinched. I couldn't help it. It felt like someone had kicked me in the ribs. That gate was the border between the world and my sanctuary. It was the line I had drawn in the sand. With a final deafening crack, the gate gave way. It collapsed inward, twisted into a pretzel of steel, clattering onto the driveway I had poured with my own hands. The bulldozer backed up, its reverse alarm beeping, beep, 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 like a countdown. The entrance was open. The path to the workshop door was clear. Trey threw his hands up in victory. "First strike," he yelled into the megaphone. "And we are just getting started." Next up the roof, he turned the camera to face the open gap. "Look at that, folks. The path to progress is open. No more eyesores, no more obstacles." He looked back at me, grinning like a shark. "What are you going to do now, Cliff? Send another text? Call your lawyer? It is over. Go home." I looked at the twisted remains of my gate. I looked at the dark maw of the driveway leading straight to the heart of my shop where the Shelby slept. I looked at my watch. 6:59. I looked up at Trey. I didn't scream. I didn't shout. I just stared at him with a calmness that made the security guard in front of me shift his weight nervously. "You are right, Trey," I said, my voice barely audible over the idling engines. "I am going to go home." I reached into my pocket. Not for a phone, but for a pair of earplugs. I rolled the orange foam between my fingers and inserted them into my ears, because I knew what was coming. I felt it before I heard it. The coffee in Sarah's cup rippled. The loose gravel at my feet started to dance. The security guard looked down at the ground, confused. "Is that..." Is that an earthquake? I crossed my arms and leaned back against the chain-link fence. No, I said. That is the cavalry. Trey stopped celebrating. He looked around, trying to find the source of the vibration. It was getting louder. A deep, thumping bass that seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. It wasn't the chaotic clatter of construction equipment. It was a synchronized, rhythmic idle. Bum, 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 bum. The sound of aggressive camshafts. The sound of high compression. Trey looked down the street to the east, then to the west. His jaw dropped. The bulldozer driver killed his engine. The sudden silence from the yellow machine made the approaching thunder even louder. Trey lowered the megaphone. Sarah stepped away from him, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "What is that?" Trey whispered. I smiled. "That," I said, "is the heavy metal." The vibration moved from the ground into the steel bones of the bulldozer. I saw the operator hesitate. He lifted his foot off the gas pedal, and the black smoke belching from the stack thinned out. The massive blade, which was hovering just inches from the brick facade of my workshop, stopped its descent. The driver looked around, his eyes wide and confused behind the dirty plexiglass of the cab. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at this coffee in his cup holder, which was rippling in concentric circles like something out of a dinosaur movie. Trey screamed into the megaphone, his voice cracking with impatience. "Why are you stopping?" I said. "Crush it." But the operator didn't move. He couldn't move, because the sound wasn't just coming from the street anymore. It was coming from everywhere. It was bouncing off the siding of the houses, echoing down the alleyways, a low-frequency roar that hit you in the chest like a physical blow. It was the sound of Detroit. It was the sound of big block displacement, of high-compression pistons fighting against cylinder walls, of aggressive camshafts, chopping the air into a rhythm that every car lover knows as the heartbeat of America. I kept my arms crossed, leaning against the fence, watching the color drain from Trey's face. He looked to the left, then he looked to the right, and then they appeared. From the east end of Oak Street, the nose of a 1969 Chevrolet Camaro SS poked around the corner. It was painted hugger orange with dual black stripes gleaming under the morning sun like a weapon of war. The chrome bumper caught the light, sending a blinding flare across the construction site. It didn't speed. It didn't screech its tires. It crawled forward at a menacing idle speed, the 427 engine under the hood rumbling with a violence that promised destruction if unleashed. Trey spun around to look at the west end of the street. A 1970 Dodge Charger pitch black rolled into view. It was wide, low, and mean, looking like a shark moving through dark water. Its hidden headlights were like eyes narrowed in judgment. Following close behind it was a metallic blue Pontiac GTO, the Judge Edition, with its rear spoiler cutting through the air. One by one, they turned onto the block. It was a parade of legends. A Ford Mustang Fastback in Highland Green, a Plymouth Barracuda in plum-crazy purple, a Chevrolet Chevelle LS6 that shook the pavement with every revolution of its crankshaft. They kept coming. 5, 10, 20, 32. The street, which had been empty and silent just minutes ago, was now filled with millions of dollars of classic American steel. The air instantly filled with the sweet, rich smell of high-octane gasoline and exhaust, chasing away the foul stench of the diesel fumes. Trey stood on the bed of the pickup truck, his mouth hanging open. He lowered the megaphone, forgetting to switch it off. His breathing was audible over the speaker system, short, shallow gasps of panic. "Who are these people?" he stammered, looking at the security guards. "Stop them! Don't let them block the street!" The head of security, the man who had threatened me just moments ago, took a step back. He looked at the line of cars. He looked at the width of their tires. He looked at the sheer mass of metal moving toward him. "I am not stepping in front of that boss," the guard muttered. The cars didn't just drive by. They executed a maneuver that was so precise it had to have been choreographed. The Camaro and the Charger, leading the two columns from opposite ends of the street, met exactly in front of the demolition site. They stopped nose to nose, their bumpers inches apart, blocking the main gate perfectly. Then the cars behind them fanned out. They pulled onto the curb. They pulled onto the grass. They angled themselves inward, creating a perfect semicircle of steel that mirrored the position of the bulldozers. It was a siege. The bulldozers, massive and yellow and clumsy, were suddenly surrounded by agile, predatory machines. The construction equipment looked utilitarian and ugly next to the sculpted lines of the muscle cars. It was a clash of two worlds, the world of corporate destruction versus the world of mechanical art. Trey jumped down from the truck, his face flushing from pale to a deep, angry crimson. He ran toward the fence, waving his arms at the lead Camaro. "You cannot park here!" he screamed, his voice shrill and desperate. "This is a construction zone! Move these cars immediately, or I will have them towed!" The engine of the Camaro revved once. Vroom! It was a short, sharp bark that silenced Trey instantly. It was a warning. A lion growling at a hyena. Sarah was standing frozen near the gate. She looked at the line of cars, her eyes darting from one to the other. She recognized them. She had grown up in my shop. She knew these silhouettes. She pointed a shaking finger at the blue GTO. That is the Judge," she whispered. "Dad restored that car 10 years ago." She looked at the red Chevelle. "And that one. Dad built that engine." She turned to look at me across the street. I was still standing there, calm, unmoving. Our eyes locked. I saw the realization hit her. These weren't strangers. These weren't random car enthusiasts out for a morning cruise. This was an army. And I was the general. Trey didn't understand. He didn't see the history. He only saw obstacles. He pulled out his phone, his fingers trembling so hard he nearly dropped it. "I am calling the police," he yelled at the windshield of the Camaro. "I am calling the police, and I am having every single one of you arrested for obstruction of traffic, trespassing, and harassment." He dialed 911, putting the phone to his ear, pacing back and forth in the dirt like a caged animal. "Hello, yes. This is Trey Caldwell. I am at 42 Oak Street. I have an emergency. A gang has surrounded my construction site." "Yes, a gang. They are in cars. They are blocking my equipment." "Send everyone. I want them all in handcuffs." I watched him unravel. It was pathetic. He was a man who was used to fighting with paper, with lawsuits, with money. He didn't know how to fight against raw presence. He didn't know how to handle men who didn't care about his net worth. The bulldozer operator finally made a decision. He reached up and turned the key. The massive diesel engine shuddered and died. The sudden silence from the machine was shocking. "Why did you stop, Trey?" screamed, spinning around. "Turn it back on." The operator opened the door of the cab and climbed down. He shook his head, spitting on the ground. "I am out," the operator said. "What do you mean you are out?" Trey demanded. "I am a union operator," the man said, gesturing at the wall of muscle cars. "I drive dozers. I don't crush classic cars. You see that Mustang over there? That is a 1968 fastback. If I scratch the paint on that thing, I will never get work in this state again. And besides," the operator looked at me, then back at Trey, "those guys aren't moving. And I am not running over a Shelby GT 500. You didn't tell me there was a legend in that shed." "You are fired," Trey shrieked. "You are fired! Get off my site!" The operator just shrugged, grabbed his lunchbox, and walked toward the gate, slipping between the bumpers of the Camaro and the Charger. He gave the hood of the Camaro a respectful pat as he walked by. Now it was just Trey, Sarah, and the nervous security guards trapped inside the ring of steel. The 32 cars sat there idling. The sound was hypnotic, a low throbbing rhythm that seemed to synchronize with my own heartbeat. It wasn't aggressive anymore. It was protective. It was a shield. I took the earplugs out of my ears and put them back in my pocket. I didn't need them anymore. The demolition was paused. The dust was settling. I stepped off the curb and walked toward the middle of the street. The security guard who had blocked me earlier watched me approach. He looked at the cars, then looked at me. He stepped aside without a word, lowering his head. I walked right up to the grille of the lead Camaro. I ran my hand over the warm orange metal of the hood. I could feel the engine vibrating underneath. I knew this car. I knew every bolt, every wire, every shim in the differential. I had taught the owner how to install the headers when he was just a skinny kid with greasy hair. Trey ran over to the other side of the fence, gripping the chain links with white knuckles. "Cliff," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Tell them to move. You are going to pay for this. Every minute of delay is costing me thousands of dollars. I will sue you. I will sue all of them." I looked at him through the fence. He looked so small now. The arrogance was gone, replaced by the terrified desperation of a man who sees his house of cards swaying in the wind. "You can't sue Gravity Trey," I said quietly. "And you can't sue loyalty." Just then, the driver's door of the Camaro opened. Trey stepped back, puffing out his chest, trying to regain some authority. "All right," he yelled. "Let's see who the tough guy is. Step out and show me your license. I will have your name on a police report in 5 minutes." The driver stepped out. He wasn't wearing a leather jacket. He wasn't holding a tire iron. He wasn't a thug. He was wearing a tan uniform with a gold star pinned to his chest. He adjusted his wide-brimmed hat and stepped around the door. Sheriff Billy Miller looked at Trey with eyes that had seen everything. He placed a hand on his holstered service weapon, not threateningly, just resting it there comfortably. "I don't think you need to see my license, Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff said, his voice calm and authoritative. "But I believe I need to see yours, and your permits." Trey froze. His mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. He looked at the sheriff. Then he looked at the black Charger next to it. The door of the Charger opened. A man in a black judicial robe stepped out, holding a gavel in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Judge Paxson. The door of the Cadillac behind them opened. A man in a 3-piece gray suit stepped out, adjusting his silk tie. "Mr. Wallace, the bank president." One by one, the drivers stepped out of their cars. They weren't a gang. They were the town council. They were the business owners. They were the pillars of the community. And they were all looking at Trey. The heavy metal had arrived, and now's heavy hammer was about to fall. The silence that followed the shutdown of the engines was heavier than the noise. It hung over the street like a fog. Trey was panting, his chest heaving beneath his stiff new jacket, his eyes darting between the 32 machines that had imprisoned him. He looked at the tinted windows, waiting for the thugs to emerge. He expected baseball bats. He expected tire irons. He expected men with grease under their fingernails and tattoos on their necks. The kind of men he could easily villainize for his live stream audience. But when the doors began to open, the narrative Trey had built in his head started to crumble. The driver of the lead Camaro, the sheriff, stepped out first. He didn't slam the door. He closed it with a respectful click. He adjusted his tan uniform, the gold star on his chest catching the morning sun. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by years of dealing with the worst parts of human nature. Trey didn't recognize him immediately. Panic has a way of blinding you to the obvious. He just saw a uniform. He saw a badge. And for a split second, relief washed over his face, so intense it looked painful. "Thank God," Trey screamed, pointing a trembling finger at the sheriff. "Officer, arrest them. Do you see this? They are blocking a commercial thoroughfare. They are menacing a private business owner. I want them all in cuffs." Trey ran toward the fence, gripping the chain links, his face pressed against the metal, like a prisoner pleading for release. Sheriff Grady Miller didn't run. He walked. He walked with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who owns the ground he stands on. He stopped 3 feet from the fence, hooking his thumbs into his duty belt. He looked at Trey, then he looked at the bulldozers, and finally he looked at the crushed remains of my steel gate lying twisted on the driveway. "I am talking to you," Trey yelled, his voice cracking. Why aren't you calling for backup? These people are terrorists. Sheriff Grady took off his sunglasses. His eyes were cold, the color of flint. Mr. Caldwell, the sheriff, said, his voice deep and resonant, carrying effortlessly across the silent street. I don't see any terrorists. I see a gathering of concerned citizens. And I see a significant amount of heavy industrial machinery operating in a residential zone before 7 a.m. Trey blinked, confused. What, I have a permit, I have a demolition order. Sheriff Grady pulled a small notepad from his pocket. He flipped it open. I checked the noise ordinance logs this morning. Your permit allows for operation starting at 800 hours. My dash cam recorded your engines revving at 0615. That is a violation of County Code Section 402. Trey sputtered. Are you kidding me? You are worried about noise. Look at them. They have surrounded me. The sheriff ignored him. He looked at the bulldozer nearest the gate. And I also see a commercial-class excavator with a blade width exceeding 12 feet. According to the Department of Transportation, moving that equipment onto a residential street requires a police escort and road closure markers. I don't see any markers, Mr. Caldwell. Trey's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen before. This is ridiculous. I am developing this neighborhood. I am increasing property values. You should be thanking me, not citing me for traffic violations. Sheriff Grady stepped closer to the fence. He leaned in, his voice dropping an octave. I am not citing you for traffic violations, son. I am impounding your equipment. As of right now, this is a crime scene investigation regarding the destruction of private property. Destruction of... Trey looked at the gate. That is my gate. I bought the land. That remains to be seen, a new voice said. The rear door of the black Lincoln Continental opened. A man stepped out. He was older, his hair silver and perfectly coiffed. He wore a black judicial robe over a suit unzipped, flapping slightly in the breeze. He held a leather briefcase in one hand and a travel mug in the other. Trey froze. He recognized this man. Everyone in the county recognized this man. It was Judge Thomas Paxson, the presiding judge of the circuit court, the man who signed the warrants, the man who put people away for life. Judge Paxson didn't look at Trey. He walked over to the sheriff, handed him his coffee cup, and opened his briefcase on the hood of the Lincoln. He pulled out a document stamped with a heavy red seal. Trey, Sarah whispered. Her voice was trembling. That is Judge Paxson. Why is Judge Paxson here? Trey backed away from the fence. I don't know. Maybe he is here to help us. Maybe he saw the news. Judge Paxson walked to the fence. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. When a judge speaks, the world listens, Trey Caldwell, the judge said. Yes. Yes, Your Honor, Trey stammered, trying to smooth his hair, trying to look respectable. I am the victim here. These men, you are hereby served with an emergency injunction, the judge interrupted, thrusting the paper through the gap in the fence. This is a cease and desist order effective immediately. All construction, demolition, and alteration of the property at 42 Oak Street is suspended pending a forensic audit of the land survey and title transfer. Trey stared at the paper as if it were a bomb. He didn't take it. It fluttered to the ground at his feet. Audit, Trey whispered. What audit? We received credible evidence this morning, the judge continued, his tone dry and professional, that the zoning maps submitted to the Planning Commission were altered, and that the power of attorney used to transfer the deed may have been executed under duress or medical incapacity. Trey looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at me. Her face was pale. She realized then that the secret I had discovered wasn't just a hunch. It was a weapon. This is a mistake, Trey said, his voice weak. My lawyers will... Your lawyers are the ones who called my chambers an hour ago to distance themselves from you, the judge said. Apparently, they don't like being associated with federal mortgage fraud. Sarah breathed. She stepped away from Trey as if he were contagious. You told me the paperwork was clean. You told me the lawyers handled everything. I can explain, Trey stammered, reaching for her arm. Don't touch her, the sheriff barked. Trey flinched. He looked around. He was trapped. The bulldozers were silent. His security guards had quietly retreated to the sidewalk, taking off their earpieces, realizing they were on the wrong side of the law. He was alone in the dirt, surrounded by the very authority he had tried to manipulate. And then it happened. The moment that broke him completely. The sheriff turned away from the fence. The judge turned away. They weren't looking at Trey anymore. He had ceased to matter. He was just a nuisance to be processed. They turned to look at me. I was still standing on the curb, my hands in my pockets, wearing my old flannel shirt and work boots. I hadn't said a word during the exchange. I hadn't needed to. Sheriff Grady Miller walked across the street. He stopped in front of me. He didn't salute. He did something better. He took off his hat and held it against his chest. "Morning, Chief," Grady said. His voice was soft, respectful. The voice of a boy who remembered who had taught him to fix his first bicycle. "Sorry we were cutting it close. The GTO was running a little rich. I might need you to look at the carburetor." I smiled. A real smile. "It is the float bowl, Billy. You always set it too high." The sheriff chuckled. "Yes, sir. I will adjust it." Judge Paxson walked over next. He extended his hand. It was the hand that held the gavel, the hand that decided the fate of thousands. But when he took my hand, his grip was humble. "Good to see you," Cliff, the judge, said. "Hello, Sparky," I said, using the nickname he had earned 20 years ago when he accidentally shorted out a fuse box in the shop. The judge laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "I haven't heard that name in a long time. You kept the shop standing, Chief. We are just here to make sure it stays that way." Then the others started to come forward. The drivers of the Mustangs, the Chargers, the Chevelles. They stepped out of their cars. Some wore suits, some wore scrubs. One was wearing a pilot's uniform. Another wore the jumpsuit of a master electrician. They formed a line. They didn't crowd me. They just stood there nodding, smiling, acknowledging the man who had given them a place to belong when the world had written them off. "Master," one of them said. "Chief," another nodded. "Boss," "Teacher." Trey watched this from behind the fence. He gripped the wire mesh, his knuckles white. He looked at Sarah. "Who is he?" Trey whispered, his voice trembling with genuine fear. "Who is your father?" "I thought he was just a mechanic." Sarah looked at me. She looked at the sheriff, the judge, the doctors, and the businessmen surrounding me. She looked at the respect in their eyes. She looked at the way they deferred to me, not because I had money, not because I had power, but because I had earned it. She started to cry. Silent tears that ran down her face. She realized what she had almost destroyed. She realized that while Trey had been chasing net worth, I had been building a network of human value. "He is not just a mechanic," Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. "He is the man who fixed them." I looked past the sheriff and the judge, locking eyes with Trey one last time. The fear in his eyes was absolute. He realized he hadn't just picked a fight with an old man. He had picked a fight with a legacy. And the man holding the final piece of the puzzle, the man who would turn this from a halted demolition into a prison sentence, was just stepping out of the black Cadillac at the end of the line. I nodded to Mr. Wallace. It was time for the checkmate. The silence on the street was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating silence that usually precedes a tornado. Trey stood in the dirt, his expensive shoes coated in dust, looking from the sheriff to the judge, his mind frantically trying to find an exit. He was a man who lived by the deal, by the spin, by the ability to talk his way out of any corner. But you cannot talk your way out of a blockade of 32 muscle cars, and you certainly cannot talk your way past the thud. glare of the men standing in front of them. Then the rear door of the black Cadillac at the end of the line opened. The man who stepped out was immaculate. He wore a charcoal three-piece suit that fit him like armor. His tie was silk-tied in a perfect Windsor knot. He held a leather portfolio in one hand, gripping it with the same precision he used to grip a torque wrench when he was 17 years old. Arthur Wallace, the president of the First National Bank of Michigan. Trey's face lit up. It was a desperate, manic flicker of hope. He saw the banker and thought he saw a lifeline. He thought he saw his partner, the man who had approved the loan, the man who had a vested interest in seeing this project succeed. "Arthur," Trey shouted, stumbling forward, his hands reaching out. "Thank God you are here. Tell them. Tell these people who I am. Tell them we have a contract. Tell them the bank owns this land as collateral and they are interfering with a secured asset." Arthur did not smile. He did not extend his hand. He walked past the judge, past the sheriff, and walked right up to the chain-link fence. He looked at Trey, not with anger, but with the cold, clinical detachment of an auditor looking at a bankrupt ledger. "We do have a contract," Trey Arthur said. His voice was smooth, polished, but underneath it lay the hardness of the pavement we stood on. "And that contract is based on the documents you submitted to my loan committee 3 months ago." "Exactly." Trey nodded vigorously, wiping sweat from his forehead. "The documents are solid. The title is clear. These people are just—" Arthur raised a hand, silencing him. He lifted the leather portfolio and unzipped it. He pulled out a thick stack of papers. They were clipped together, flagged with red sticky notes. Trey Arthur said, tossing the file over the fence. The papers hit Trey in the chest and scattered onto the ground, mixing with the gravel and the dust. "I received an email late last night," Arthur continued, "from a very reliable source. This source provided me with the original 1920 zoning survey of this property." Trey froze. He looked down at the papers at his feet. He recognized them. They were copies of his own loan application, but someone had taken a red marker to them. Someone had circled the property lines. "I stayed up all night with my risk management team," Arthur said. "We compared your submission against the county archives. It seems there is a discrepancy. A 30-foot discrepancy." Trey swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed. That is just a clerical error, Arthur, a surveyor's mistake. We can fix it. I can file an amendment." "It is not a mistake," Arthur said, his voice dropping to a growl. "It is fraud. You included the municipal drainage easement in your lot square footage to inflate the appraisal value. You claimed you owned land that belongs to the city, so you could qualify for a Tier 1 construction loan. That is $3 million you borrowed against land that does not exist." Sarah gasped. She put a hand to her throat, backing away from Trey. $3 million. You told me the loan was for $1 million. Trey spun around to her, his eyes wild. Sarah, shut up. Don't listen to him. Arthur ignored the interruption. He pointed a finger at Trey through the fence. "And that is not all. My source also suggested I look into the power of attorney document you used to sign the mortgage deed. We ran a signature verification analysis this morning. The signature on that deed does not match the signature on Mr. Henderson's pension checks. It is a forgery, Trey." The word hung in the air. Forgery. "That is federal bank fraud," Arthur said. "That is wire fraud. And since you used the U.S. mail to send the documents, that is mail fraud. My legal team has already contacted the FBI. The bank is calling the loan, Trey. Immediately. We are seizing all assets associated with Caldwell Development to recoup our losses. This land does not belong to you. It never did." Trey looked at Arthur, then he looked at the judge, and finally his eyes landed on me. I was standing next to Arthur now. I looked at the man who had tried to bury me. I didn't say a word. I just tapped the breast pocket of my flannel shirt where my old flip phone sat. "You," Trey whispered. "You did this. You sent him the maps. I told you, Trey, I said calmly. I keep everything. I kept the maps, and I kept the relationships you thought were worthless. Arthur learned how to spot a counterfeit part in my shop 20 years ago. You really thought you could slip a counterfeit deed past him? Trey began to shake. It started in his hands and spread to his knees. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him harder than any bulldozer blade. The debts, the bookies, the lies. It was all over. Sheriff Arthur said, turning to Grady, First National Bank is formally pressing charges. Sheriff Grady Miller nodded. He reached for his belt. The sound of the leather snapping open was loud in the quiet street. He unhooked the handcuffs. They were steel, heavy, real. Trey Caldwell, step away from the fence, the sheriff ordered. No, Trey stammered, backing up. No, you can't. I need time. I can fix this. I just need to make a few calls. Step away from the fence and put your hands behind your back, the sheriff repeated, his voice hardening. Trey looked around for an escape. He looked at the open gate, but it was blocked by the Camaro and the Charger. He looked at the construction workers, but they had all turned their backs on him, distancing themselves from the radioactive fallout of a felony. Then his eyes fell on Sarah. She was standing a few feet away, tears streaming down her face, staring at the scattered papers on the ground. She looked shattered. The man she loved, the man she had betrayed her father for, was a criminal. Trey lunged at her. It wasn't an attack. It was something more cowardly. He grabbed her arm, pulling her in front of him like a human shield, pointing a shaking finger at her face. She knew. Trey screamed, his voice high and shrill. She signed it. The power of attorney. She is the one who gave me the authority. She is in on it. If I am going down, she is coming with me. She is the accomplice, Sarah screamed, trying to pull away. Trey, what are you doing? Let me go! Tell them! Trey shrieked, shaking her. Tell them you wanted the money. Tell them you wanted the old man out of the way. I watched my daughter's face. In that moment, the last fragment of her illusion broke. She didn't just see a desperate man. She saw a predator. She saw a man who would sacrifice her without a second thought to save his own skin. That was the breaking point. Sheriff Grady didn't wait. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He vaulted over the crushed gate, closing the distance in 2 strides. He grabbed Trey's wrist, twisting it behind his back with a practiced motion that forced Trey to release Sarah. Trey howled in pain as his face was pressed into the dirt of the driveway, the same dirt he had ordered to be bulldozed. You have the right to remain silent, the sheriff boomed, leaning his weight onto Trey's back. Click, click. The handcuffs ratcheted shut. It was the most beautiful mechanical sound I had ever heard, better than a perfectly tuned carburetor, better than a red line shift. It was the sound of justice. Sarah stumbled back, clutching her arm where he had grabbed her. She looked down at Trey, who was writhing in the dust, spitting curses, blaming everyone but himself. She looked up at me. I was still standing on the other side of the fence. I didn't move to comfort her yet. She needed to feel this. She needed to see the raw, ugly truth of who she had chosen. Trey was hauled to his feet by the sheriff. His expensive jacket was torn. His face was smeared with mud. He looked at the camera on his phone, which was still sitting on the hood of the truck, broadcasting everything to the internet. Turn it off, Trey screamed at the empty air. Turn it off, Sheriff Grady walked him toward the patrol car. As they passed me, Trey looked at me one last time. His eyes were full of hate, but mostly they were full of confusion. He still didn't understand how he had lost. I told you, Trey, I said softly as he passed. You can't buy respect. You have to build it. The sheriff shoved him into the back seat of the cruiser. The door slammed shut, sealing him inside a cage of safety glass and wire mesh. The street was quiet again. The Sunday crew stood by their cars, silent witnesses to the cleanup. Arthur Wallace walked over to the fence and picked up the scattered loan documents. I am sorry it came to this, Cliff, Arthur said, tapping the file against his leg. If I had known sooner, You came when it mattered, Arthur, I said. That is what counts. Arthur nodded. He looked at Sarah, who was standing alone in the middle of the construction site. She looked small, lost, a child again. The bank will release the lien on the property by the end of the day, Arthur said. The deed reverts to the original owner once the fraud is processed. It is your land again, Cliff, free and clear. Thank you, Arthur. I opened the gate. The twisted metal groaned as I pushed it aside, creating a gap wide enough for a man to walk through. I walked onto my property. I walked past the bulldozers. I walked past the spot where Trey had been arrested. I stopped in front of Sarah. She couldn't look at me. She was trembling, staring at her boots, waiting for the lecture. Waiting for the "I told you so." Waiting for the anger. I didn't yell. I didn't scold. I reached out and took the car keys from her hand. The keys to the SUV Trey had bought her. You are not driving that, I said. She nodded, tears dripping off her chin. I know, I am sorry, Dad. I am so sorry. I didn't know. I really didn't know he was. I know you didn't, I said. You were blind. But now you see. I looked at the workshop. The red condemnation sticker was still on the door. The walls were still standing. Inside, the Shelby was safe. But looking at my daughter broken and sobbing in the dirt, I realized that saving the car was the easy part. Fixing what was broken between us, that was going to take a lot more than a wrench. But I was a mechanic. I didn't throw things away when they broke. I rebuilt them. Come on, I said, gesturing to the open door of the shop. Grab a broom. We have a lot of mess to clean up before we can start working. She looked up at me, shocked. You want me to help? I looked at the Sunday crew standing behind me. My army. My family. We don't leave people behind in the wreckage, Sarah. We tow them home. I turned and walked toward the shop, pulling my keys from my pocket to unlock the padlock. I didn't look back to see if she was following. I knew she would. She was a Henderson after all. And Hendersons might get lost, but they always find their way back to the garage. The sound of the police cruiser fading into the distance was the only noise on Oak Street for a long time. The sirens wailed like a mourning cry for Trey's career, getting softer and softer until they were swallowed by the hum of the morning traffic on the highway. I stood at the threshold of my workshop, the brass key warm in my hand, looking at the heavy padlock that had barred me from my own life for the last 24 hours. Behind me, I heard the crunch of footsteps on the gravel. Light. Hesitant. I didn't turn around. I knew the cadence of those steps. I had listened to them running down the hallway when she was 5 and stomping up the stairs when she was 15. Dad. Sarah's voice cracked. It was a small sound, stripped of all the pretense and arrogance she had worn like a costume for the last few months. I kept my eyes on the padlock. I inserted the key and turned it. The mechanism clicked open with a heavy, satisfying snap. I pulled the shackle free and let the chain fall against the wood. Clink. I didn't know, Dad. She continued, her voice gaining a little more strength, desperate to bridge the silence. I swear to you. Trey told me everything was legal. He showed me papers. He said the lawyers approved it. I thought I was helping you. I thought I was saving you. I finally turned around. Sarah was standing 10 feet away, her arms wrapped around herself. Her expensive coat was covered in dust from where Trey had used her as a shield. Her mascara was running. She looked like a child who had broken a priceless vase and was waiting for the punishment. I looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in months. I saw the fear in her eyes. But I also saw the relief. The relief that she hadn't actually succeeded in destroying me. I walked over to the side of the building where we kept the cleaning supplies. I picked up a heavy-duty push broom, the kind with stiff red bristles that could move gravel and oil dry. I walked back and held it out to her. She looked at the broom, then at me, confusion clouding her tear-filled eyes. "You want me to sweep?" she asked. I didn't offer her a hug. I didn't offer her words of comfort. Not yet. A hug would be easy. A hug would be cheap. And after what she had done, we couldn't afford cheap anymore. "You broke the trust, Sarah," I said, my voice steady and low. "Trust is not like a fender bender. You can't just hammer it out and paint over it. Trust is like a transmission. When you strip the gears, the whole thing has to come apart. You have to inspect every single piece. You have to rebuild it gear by gear, bolt by bolt. It takes time. And it takes work." She reached out and took the broom. Her hands were shaking, but she gripped the wooden handle tight. "I will work," she whispered. "I will do whatever it takes. I will pay you back every cent Trey stole. I will." I held up a hand. "We are not talking about money. We are talking about sweat. You chose the easy way out, Sarah. You chose the fast cash and the smooth talker. You forgot that anything worth having is built with your hands, not signed with a pen. So if you want to be my daughter again, if you want to be a Henderson, you start here. You start with the mess you helped make." She nodded, biting her lip to stop a fresh wave of tears. She turned and walked toward the pile of debris at the gate, dragging the broom through the dirt. It was a small start, but it was a start. I turned back to the workshop door. I grabbed the handle and slid the heavy steel door along its track. It groaned a sound of protest after being sealed shut, and then rolled open, revealing the cavernous darkness inside. The smell hit me first. Old oil, sawdust, cold steel, the perfume of my existence. I stepped inside and flipped the breaker switch. The overhead fluorescent lights flickered, buzzed, and then bathed the room in a stark white glow. There it was. In the center of the bay, under a heavy gray canvas tarp, sat the shape that Trey had called junk, the shape that Sarah had been willing to crush. I walked over to it. I felt the presence of the men behind me. The Sunday crew. They had quietly followed me into the shop. 32 of the most powerful men in the state crowded into the doorway, standing shoulder to shoulder. The sheriff, the judge, the banker, the CEO. They fell silent. They knew what was under the tarp. They had heard the rumors, the whispers of the ghost project I had been working on. But none of them had seen it. I reached out and grabbed the corner of the canvas. "Gentlemen," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Meet the retirement plan." I pulled the tarp back in one smooth motion. The canvas slid off, pooling on the concrete floor. A collective gasp filled the room. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated reverence. Sitting on the jack stands was the chassis of the 1967 Shelby GT500 Super Snake. It wasn't finished, but it was glorious. The body was painted in Wimbledon white, the layers of lacquer so deep they looked wet. The dual blue Le Mans stripes ran down the center like a badge of honor. The hood was off, resting on a stand nearby, revealing the heart of the beast. The 427 cubic inch V8 engine. I had spent 3 years polishing the aluminum intake manifold until it shone like a mirror. The dual quad carburetors sat on top like a crown. Arthur Wallace, the bank president, stepped forward. He reached out a hand as if to touch the fender, then pulled back, afraid to leave a fingerprint. "My God," Cliff Arthur whispered. "It is real. I thought it was a myth. I thought the Super Snake was just a story you told us to keep us motivated." "It is real," I said, running my hand along the roofline. "And it is safe." Sheriff Grady walked around the back of the car, shaking his head in disbelief. "Look at that differential. You machined that housing yourself, didn't you, Chief?" "I had to," I said. "You can't buy parts for a ghost. You have to make them." Sarah had stopped sweeping. She was standing in the doorway, the broom forgotten in her hand. She was staring at the car. She didn't see an engine. She didn't see a suspension. She saw the thousands of hours I had spent out here. She saw the nights I missed dinner. She saw the obsession. But for the first time, she understood the value. She realized that I hadn't been hoarding junk. I had been curating a masterpiece. She walked in slowly, her eyes wide. "Dad," she said softly, "it is beautiful." I looked at her. "It is not just beautiful, Sarah. It is history. And you almost let them turn it into a soda can." She looked down at her feet, the shame washing over her again. "But it is still here," I said, softening my tone just a fraction. "It is still here because good people stood up." I looked around at the crew. These men in their suits and uniforms standing in a dusty garage on a Tuesday morning. They had risked their reputations. They had risked arrest. They had come because I asked. "All right, boys," I said, clapping my hands together. "The show is over. You all have jobs to get to. Courts to run. Banks to manage. Criminals to catch." Judge Paxson took off his judicial robe. He folded it neatly and placed it on top of a tool chest. Then he unbuttoned his cuffs and rolled up the sleeves of his white dress shirt. "The court is in recess," the judge said, smiling. "And I don't think I am going anywhere, Chief. That gate outside looks like a mess. You can't haul that steel by yourself with a bad hip." Mr. Wallace took off his suit jacket and hung it on a peg next to my grease-stained coveralls. He loosened his tie. "I have a board meeting at 10, Arthur said. "I think I will cancel it. I haven't held a shovel in 20 years. I need to see if I still have the calluses." One by one, they stripped away the layers of their success. Jackets came off. Ties were stuffed into pockets. Sleeves were rolled up. The sheriff went to his trunk and pulled out a pair of work gloves. The CEO of the logistics company grabbed a wheelbarrow. They didn't leave. They didn't pat me on the back and drive away. They stayed. For the next 3 hours, my workshop wasn't filled with the sound of engines. It was filled with the sound of laughter, the sound of metal dragging on concrete, the sound of men working together. I watched them. I watched the judge and the sheriff grunting as they lifted the twisted remains of the gate. I watched the banker sweeping up the broken glass. I watched Sarah working right alongside them, her face streaked with dirt, hauling buckets of debris to the dumpster. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't checking her phone. She was sweating. And for the first time in a long time, she looked like my daughter. I stood by the Shelby wiping a speck of dust from the fender with a microfiber cloth. A feeling of profound peace settled over me. Trey had money. He had flash. He had the ability to buy people for a moment. But the moment the money ran out, he was alone in that police car. He had built a life on transactions. I had built a life on transformation. I took broken things and made them whole. Cars, kids, communities. And looking at the scene before me, I knew that my legacy wasn't this car. The Shelby was just metal. It would be sold one day. It would sit in a museum. My real legacy was the people in this room. The loyalty that couldn't be bought. The respect that survived time and distance. I walked over to Sarah. She was struggling with a heavy piece of the fence. I reached out and grabbed the other end. "Here," I said. "Lift with your knees, not your back." Remember, she looked up at me, sweat dripping from her nose. I remember Dad. We lifted it together. We threw it into the dumpster. It landed with a heavy thud, the final echo of the battle. We stood there for a moment, catching our breath. "I am sorry about the gate," she said. "We can build a new one," I said. "A stronger one. And this time we will weld it together." She smiled. It was a weak, tired smile, but it was real. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, I realized that I was the richest man in the world. I didn't have Trey's millions. I didn't have a condo complex. But I had this. I had the heavy metal, and I had the heavy hearts of the people who loved me. You can tear down a building. You can bulldoze a house. You can even steal a deed. But you cannot destroy respect. That is the one thing in this world that you have to earn. And once you have it, it is lighter than air, but stronger than steel. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it reminds you that the family you build is sometimes just as important as the family you are born into, and that standing your ground is worth it, even when the odds are stacked against you. If you have ever had to fight for what is yours, or if you have ever been underestimated because of your age or your job, let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. What would you have done if you were in my shoes? Would you have forgiven Sarah? Let's talk about it. And if you want to hear more stories about justice served cold and engines running hot, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. The Sunday crew is always looking for new members. Until next time, keep your hands dirty and your head high. This is Cliff Henderson signing off.